Hello and welcome to another Dominions 6 Deep Dives. In this one we're going to be going over everybody's favourite topic, Communions. Communions are a way for you to boost up your mage's path levels and spread out the fatigue of spell casting between themselves and their Communion slaves in combat. There's been a few changes in Communions between Dominions 5 and 6, so I'll try and address them here where I can. So, there are three types of Communions: Astral Communions, Blood Sabbaths, and Choir Choruses. You can get to each type of Communion using their respective Communion Master, Communion Slave, or the different spells for the other different types. The main research pass to get into Communions is Thaumaturgy level 1 for Communion Master, Communion Slave, as well as Chorus Master and Chorus Slave for Middle-Aged Man, or Blood Magic 1 for Sabbath Master and Sabbath Slave for the Blood variant. Each type of Communion uses the same participants, masters, and slaves. There can be one Communion of each type active at the same time for your forces, and they will not overlap. So Sabbath Slaves and Communion Masters, for example, will not interact with each other. Likewise for Sabbath Masters and Communion Slaves, etc. This is one of the big changes from Dominion 5 to Dominion 6, so make sure you change your tactics accordingly. Each type of Communion has slightly minor differences, which I'll show up here on the screen. Astral Communions take 25% longer in order to cast their spells. Sabbaths will half the fatigue the caster receives, but increase the fatigue received by all slaves in the Sabbath by 20%. Choruses take 25% longer to cast spells, and slaves will drop out of the Communion when losing consciousness. Choruses are only available to Middle-Aged Man, as I've said, and can only be joined by spell singers who are able to cast the Choir Master or Choir Slave spell, which costs glamour. For a valid Communion to take place, there must be at least one Master and one Slave on the battlefield, either by casting the required Communion Master and Slave spells or through magical items. If a Communion breaks because all the Communion Masters are dead or have fled the battlefield, all slaves of that Communion type will be stunned for 1 round and take 3d50 fatigue damage per slave. While being a Communion Slave, those units cannot perform any actions. They can't move, they can't attack, or cast spells on their own. For any type of Communion, the Communion Masters within that Communion will receive an increase in their level to their known magical paths for 2 to every power of n slaves. So for a +1, you need 2 slaves, for a +2 you need 4, for +3 you need 8, and so on. Higher level magical paths give access to higher level spells for damage or buffing, and having additional levels in magic paths will reduce the fatigue cost of casting spells, usually half for having 1 additional, a third for having 2, and so on. The number of slaves in a Communion drops below the number required for the increase in magical paths. Say if you had 4 Communion slaves and now you're at 3, then Masters will only have +1 to their magical paths rather than +2. You do not require your Communion slaves to have the same paths as those being boosted by the Masters, though not having paths available to the slaves that the Masters use will cause undesired effects, which we'll go over soon. So when a Master casts a spell in a Communion, the fatigue is spread to the caster of the spell and all of the Communion slaves within that Communion. No other Masters are given fatigue for that spell, just the one that casted it. The fatigue cost is calculated with the Master's paths included, so having higher paths will reduce the fatigue cost of the spell, and then is divided by the number of slaves in the Communion, adding on an additional +1 person to include the Master, and then it's spread equally amongst all of those participants. For the Communion slaves, this number is then additionally modified by their magic path level, in comparison to the Masters for each individual slave, which I'll show here. So, we can see from this table, if a slave's path level is equal to the Master's, then there's no change in the fatigue. If the slave has a higher path level than the Master, then the fatigue received by the slave is halved. If the slave's magical path level is less than the Master's level, then the fatigue received is doubled. Finally, if the slave's magical path level is less than the Master's level divided by 2, or if the slave does not have a magical path in the main magical path of the spell cast, then the fatigue that slave receives is quadrupled. Additionally, for Blood Sabbaths, remember that 20% additional fatigue is added to the slaves, and the Master gains half fatigue of the fatigue they would receive for casting the spell. When it comes to fatigue, remember that every unit removes 1 fatigue every battle round. If a unit's fatigue goes above 100, then they will fall unconscious. Above 200, then they will start to take HP damage instead of increasing their fatigue. It's possible to kill your Communion slaves if you cannot find a way to reduce their fatigue from your Master's casting spells. We'll go over how to combat this later. Okay, so that's the basic for communions. So why use them? Well, communions are a good way to increase the paths of your mages without needing access to magical boosters or empowerment in battle. This can give you access to high-level army buffing or damage spells, which you can use to win a battle that you wouldn't otherwise normally have access to with the paths available to your mages. The best way to think of a communion is like a pyramid, with the masters at the top and the slaves down the bottom, with the fatigue cost of spells going down that pyramid. Using my high-tech equipment, I'll show you what I mean. Okay, now that we have this terrible image up, what do I mean? So, on the left, we have a regular communion, with fewer masters than slaves. The masters in this communion will get +2 to their magical paths due to having 4 slaves. The other 2 slaves, as part of this communion, are just extra batteries for fatigue spreading and as backup should any of our other slaves die. In this type of communion, the master should concentrate on casting higher impact spells, things like army-wide buffs, large AoE damage evocations, etc. As in this example, you only have 2 spellcasters out of a total of 8 mages. If you just want them to cast low-level spells, there's not much point in the communion. You might be better off just having the casters act independently. With these higher impact spells, however, usually comes higher fatigue, so that will get passed on to the slaves. But the masters themselves should stay conscious for longer, and be able to keep casting spells past the point where they would usually fall unconscious if they were casting by themselves. The slaves will probably also be knocked unconscious, and potentially die from the fatigue if there are too many master casters, or if they go wild with what spells they cast, but it means that you'll be able to get more out of the 2 masters, which could win you the game if you cast the right spells. The other type, which I show on the right, is an inverse communion. This is where there are more masters than there are slaves. This type is useful if you have a bunch of lower level mages that you want to buff up just a bit in order to cast some lower level spells. Let's say Astral Fires or even just Banishment versus Undead. In this case, you'll have more lower level masters at the top, in this example 6, and less communion slaves, but the communion slaves will have higher magic levels than the masters, such as these Gaija. These communions work off the idea that the master's fatigue cost for the spell is being split 3 ways, 1 part to the master and 1 part to each of the slaves. These slaves will then half the fatigue cost they receive due to being a higher magical level than the master, effectively getting rid of some of the fatigue. This fatigue will still pile up on the slaves due to the number of masters casting, but it's more fatigue efficient than just having the slaves as masters and the masters as slaves, and allows you to get more spells out per turn rather than spells being more effective individually. Which of these communions you want really comes down to the situation. If you need lots of little spells to clear out undead, use an inverse communion. If you need to cast big army-wide buffing or debuffing spells, use the one on the left. When it comes to communions, all slaves will receive caster-affecting buffs that a master in the communion casts. So if one of the master casts, for example, Summon Earth Power, we can see it has an area of effect caster. This means it'll be cast on the master and also affect any other slaves within the communion. This means that that master that casts it and all slaves within the communion will receive the benefits of the spell. In this case, they'll all get +1 to their earth magic level and an additional +4 reinvigoration, which will make your slaves less likely to be less than half of the master's level in earth, so receive less fatigue from earth spells that way, and they also have added reinvigoration, so they get rid of more fatigue every battle round. This means they're less likely to die from fatigue to HP conversions, which is quite nice. Buffing the paths of your communion slaves through buffing spells, boosters, or just using higher magic level slaves will reduce the fatigue they receive, and using fatigue reducing spells like Summon Earth Power, as we've talked about, Relief, or Reinvigorate, as well as magical items such as Boots of the Messenger, or an Amulet of Resilience, or even your Bless if you've built one with Reinvigoration, will reduce their fatigue buildup and make them last longer. A special mention should also be made for Regeneration. Regenerating communion slaves can potentially get rid of any of the HP damage they receive from being over fatigue. This is more useful on units with higher HP, of course, but it can also be useful on your human-sized communion slaves as well. Getting something like a Ring of Regeneration, or casting personal regeneration with one of your communion masters so the slaves all get regeneration as well, can be quite effective. Taking this idea, we get into what's known as TurboCommunions. TurboCommunions rely on having a high reinvigorated or regenning communion slaves to be able to handle the high fatigue costs of having equal to or even more masters than there are slaves in a communion. A classic example of this is with early age Niflheim. Using Gaijas as masters with scratty slaves, you have high magic path masters with slaves that have at best equal but more likely to have lower paths than your Gaijas. But it's the fact the scratty can specifically survive in this kind of communion due to the fact that they have inbuilt regeneration on their werewolf form. And if you give them additional reinvigoration items, or even indeed a Shroud of the Blessed Saint in order to make them sacred, that means they can deal with the damage and fatigue build-up even more. On top of that, if they start off in their scratty form and then turn into werewolves, that's 2 different pools of HP that you have to use for your Turbo Communion. This lets you massively push the fatigue cost up for this communion type, so that you can cast spells with massive fatigue cost without losing slaves. Keep this in mind if you're facing a Turbo Communion nation. So what are some tips you can take away with you that can make your communions last longer? Buffing up your slaves' paths is a great way to make them last longer, so things such as Power of the Spheres for +1 in all magical paths for both the caster and the slaves is fantastic, or using something like Light of the Northern Star if you're using an Astral Communion. This will boost every Astral Mage on the battlefield by 1 and is useful in heavy Astral Communions, or a combination of the 2. If your communion slaves are sacred, taking a Reinvigoration Bless will also massively help burn off some of their fatigue buildup. A special mention must be given to a specific blood spell, Reinvigoration. This spell is only blood 1 for 1 blood slave, and it removes all of the caster's fatigue. Notice that this has an area effect caster, so that means that if a master in a communion casts this spell, all slaves within that communion with him will also remove all of their fatigue. If you can get blood into your regular communions, this can be a great way to remove fatigue from your slaves. In blood sabbaths, it's almost required for you to cast this spell with one of your masters probably every 2 turns or so, just so your slaves don't get obliterated by fatigue damage. When it comes to how you lay out your communion, you do have some options. In Astral Communions, it doesn't matter too much, but you can leave your slaves in front of your masters and behind your troops to act as a buffer in case enemy troops get through your lines. For blood sabbaths, it's actually probably a good idea to keep your sabbath slaves near the masters. Blood mages can use any mage's blood slave that's near to them. This will let your sabbath masters use your sabbath slaves' blood slaves as long as they're in range. Now you've laid out your communion slaves, how do you keep them safe? Well, remember that they'll receive any buffs cast by a communion master so long as it has an area of effect caster. This is things like personal iron skin, personal mist form, astral shield, or personal regeneration. Things like that will really help keep your slaves alive. In addition, adding things like Fire Shield or a higher level Soul Vortex will turn your communion slaves into damage dealing bodies, used to gum up any enemies that come near them, and they can even end up killing quite a few people by just standing there blankly. Speaking of Soul Vortex, it can heal and reduce fatigue for the damage that it does, becoming a very nice cast for your slaves if there are enemies nearby. You can even use this to further power your communions. Surround your slaves with regenning friendly troops, things like Lamias that you can summon, keep them on bodyguard duty, and they'll take some damage from Soul Vortex, but also help heal up your batteries, keep their fatigue down, and also keep them safe from any enemies that can get near them. Alright, that was a deep dive into communion mechanics, how they work, and also some example of communions you can do. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to go into surrounding communions, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Until next time, take care.